Hello everybody, this is Ralph Martin from RJ Quality Consulting, and in this video I want to talk about understanding ISO 17025 Clause 6. So this is a continuing video from a series that I have been doing on understanding all of the clause elements of the standard clause by clause. So far I have addressed Clause 4, Clause 5, and today we are covering Clause 6 in a series, and I'll be covering clauses 4 through 8 of the ISO IEC 17025 2017 version of the standard. And the intent of these videos is to do a walkthrough of all of the clause elements of the standard so that the laboratory will get a better understanding of the requirements of the standard. And then for each clause element, I also talk about what the required documentation you would need to prepare for an ISO 17025 audit should your laboratory be preparing for either becoming accredited to ISO 17025, or if your laboratory is already accredited, to get a better understanding to prepare you for your next reaccreditation or surveillance assessment. So without further ado, I'd like to jump right into Clause 6 of the standard. And Clause 6 is really all about understanding resource requirements. Clause 6 focuses on the requirements for resources necessary for the effective functioning of a laboratory. And this clause covers personnel, facilities, equipment, systems, and support services. Laboratories must ensure that all resources are adequately maintained, calibrated, and verified to meet the specifications required for accurate and reliable test results or calibration results, depending on whether your laboratory is a testing laboratory or a calibration laboratory. Competence and ongoing training of personnel are also emphasized. So what I'll do is go right to Clause 6.1. So within Clause 6 of the standard, there is 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, and finally 6.6. And we'll go over each of these subclauses of Clause 6 together for each individual subclause. So we're going to jump right into Clause 6.1. This is really general. The laboratory shall have available the personnel, facilities, equipment, systems, and support services necessary to manage and perform its laboratory activity. The documentation requirements for this clause can really just be this statement within your quality manual under section 6.1. One of the things I always recommend for laboratories is to have a quality manual that is aligned with the clause elements of the standard. So in other words, your clause 6.1 of your quality manual should correspond with Clause 6.1 of the ISO IEC 17025 standard. So that would be pretty much it for Clause 6.1. It's pretty much just a statement of commitment from laboratory management. Then we get into Clause 6.2, where basically 6.2.1, 6.2.2, 6.2.3, and 6.2.4 is what we're talking about on this particular slide. So all personnel of the laboratory, either internal or external, whether you're using subcontractors or employees that could influence the laboratory activities, shall act impartially, be competent, and work in accordance with the laboratory's management system. That's 6.2.1. 6.2.2 is a laboratory shall document competence requirements. Typically, you'll see this in the form of job descriptions or in maybe a training procedure where the laboratory documents the competence requirements for each function that influences the results of the laboratory activities. And this includes requirements for education, qualification, training, technical knowledge, skills, and experience. Then Clause 6.2.3 states the laboratory shall ensure that personnel have the competence to perform laboratory activities for which they are responsible and to evaluate the significance of deviations. And finally, 6.2.4, the management of the laboratory shall communicate to personnel their duties, responsibilities, and authorities. And again, this is typically through a job description where laboratory management communicates to the analyst or employees what their duties, responsibilities are, and within this job description, you'll most likely have requirements associated with that as well. Then we get into really clause 6.2.5, and this is the first section or first clause of the standard where you will see a required procedure. There is about 11 of these statements within the standard where basically it says something to the effect of, like it does here, the laboratory shall have procedures and retain records for, and then has A through F. This is typical in about 9 or 10 areas of the standard where it literally says the laboratory shall have a procedure for ... and that procedure shall include A through F or A through H, depending on what area it is. What I'll cover today will be all of the procedures that are required for section 6, essentially. So the laboratory shall have a procedure and also shall retain records for determining competence requirements, selection of personnel, training of personnel, supervision of personnel, authorization of personnel, and monitoring competence of personnel. So these A through F requirements can be in a procedure, and they can also be in associated forms. It's completely up to the laboratory how they do that. But you definitely shall have a procedure, and then you should have a procedure and records that include A through F. Then we have section 6.2.6, the laboratory shall authorize personnel to perform specific laboratory activities, including but not limited to A, development, modification, verification, and validation of methods. So whoever is in charge of doing the method validations and verifications would need to be authorized to do so. Analysis of results, including statements of conformity or opinions and interpretations, and to report, review, and authorize results, which is typically on a test report where someone needs to authorize, approve that test report prior to it being delivered to the customer. So that is section 6.2.6. And then we move on to section 6.3. So we've covered section 6.2. That was all about personnel and training. Now we're moving on to clause 6.3, which covers facilities and environmental conditions. Now, there's not a required procedure for this section. However, it'd probably be a good idea to have one. But you do have to document where you've monitored and recorded environmental conditions in accordance with relevant specifications. So typically that would be done on some sort of monitoring form of some sort. So 6.3.1, the facilities and environmental conditions shall be suitable for the laboratory activities and shall not adversely affect the validity of results. Section 6.3.2, the requirements for facilities and environmental conditions necessary for the performance of laboratory activities shall be documented. So those requirements can either be documented in a procedure, they could be documented on your monitoring form itself, where you state what, say, the temperature and humidity requirements are of the lab. You would have the range and the maximum you would have on that actual form where you're recording the data. Because section 6.3.3, the next one says, the laboratory shall monitor, control, and record environmental conditions. This is a shall statement. That means the laboratory shall monitor, control, and record environmental conditions in accordance with relevant specifications, methods, or procedures, or where they influence the validity of the results. If the test method has specific environmental conditions associated with it, then you would use those as your specifications. If there's no real relevant specifications for the specific method, then the laboratory should have some sort of overarching requirement for environmental conditions, such as overall temperature in the lab or overall humidity of some sort of range that your laboratory shall be maintained at for the comfort of your analyst and things like that, because they do impact the test results. If the lab's 90 degrees and the air conditioning system's not working, that puts the results in danger because your analysts are probably not thinking all that clearly as they're weighing out and doing sample prep and things like that, which do impact the test results. Section 6.4.3, measures to control facilities shall be implemented, monitored, periodically reviewed, and shall include but not be limited to A, access to and use of areas affecting laboratory activities, B, preventing contamination, interference, or adverse influences on laboratory activities, and C, effective separation between areas of incompatible laboratory activities. For example, if you're doing chemical testing and microbiological testing, you might want to keep those areas separate so that you're not, say, contaminating the microbiological testing area with chemical hazards or something like that. You want to make sure that they're separated and that you're ensuring the safeguard of incompatible laboratory activities. Then there's 6.3.5. When the laboratory performs activities at sites or facilities outside its permanent control, these environmental conditions still need to apply. If your laboratory does sampling, for example, and you are using a balance out in the field to weigh a sample, those required conditions need to be met. If there are requirements for weighing samples in maximum temperature and humidity conditions, things like that. If you don't do any laboratories outside of your facility, then this particular section could be, in a sense, non-applicable. Then we move on to the rest of section, well, that was it on section 6.3. Now we're going to move into one of the more beefier sections, section 6.4, which is equipment. The laboratory shall have access to equipment, including but not limited to measuring instruments, software, measurement standards, reference materials, reference data, reference or reagents, consumable or auxiliary apparatuses that's required for the correct performance of laboratory activities and that can influence the result. So this is access. The analysts need to have access to the proper equipment to perform the test. 6.4.2, when the laboratory uses equipment outside its permanent control, it shall ensure that the requirements of this document are still met. This document pertaining to ISO 17025. If you don't do activities outside of your laboratory, this could be non-applicable. Section 6.4.3, this is the second section where a procedure is required. The laboratory shall have a procedure. This is not a if statement. I want to, as an experienced ISO 17025 assessor, I've given a lot of nonconformances in this area, and I'll get comments from the laboratory supervisor, well, we have procedures throughout all of our different test methods that talk about equipment, so we don't really need this procedure. I'm telling you, if you do that, you don't have a general overarching equipment maintenance procedure, you will get a finding. So just keep that in mind. This is a common nonconformance. So the laboratory shall have a procedure for handling, transport, storage, use, and planned maintenance of equipment in order to ensure proper functioning and prevention to prevent contamination and deterioration. This is an overarching equipment maintenance procedure that covers your maintenance program for all of your instruments. This is an overarching procedure. Individual equipment manuals don't count for this requirement. Section 644, the laboratory shall verify that equipment conforms to specified requirements before being placed or returned to service. The key on this one is return to service. So what that means, for example, if you were sending a balance out for calibration and you send it out of your laboratory, you take it out of commission, you send it out to be calibrated, it comes back. You have to verify that it works before putting it back into operation. That's what returned into service means. So that means you would use your reference weights, make sure the balance works okay before you put it back into operation. 6.4.4. 6.4.5, the equipment used for measurement shall be capable of achieving the measurement accuracy and measurement uncertainty required to provide a valid result. This is the first time in section 5 where we talk about measurement uncertainty, and I'll get more into detail of that later on. Section 6.4.6, measurement equipment shall be calibrated when the measurement accuracy or measurement uncertainty affects the validity of the reported results, and or calibration of the equipment is required to establish the metrological traceability of the reporting result. When we get into section 6.5, I'll get more into details of measurement traceability and what all that includes. So we will come back to that shortly when we get into section 6.5. So we'll continue with section 6.4. We have section 6.4.7. The laboratory shall establish a calibration program. Doesn't say it has to be procedure. It doesn't have to be a separate procedure. Most laboratories put their calibration program either into their equipment maintenance procedure, or they'll put the program within a equipment list where they show what the calibration frequency is overall. You might have a master equipment list with measurement equipment, and you'll say when it was calibrated and when it's due next for calibration. That could be considered a calibration program, but it does need to be established, and it shall be reviewed and adjusted as necessary in order to maintain confidence in the status of calibration for measurement equipment. 648, all equipment requiring calibration or which has a defined period of validity shall be labeled, coded, or otherwise identified to allow the user of the equipment to readily identify the status of calibration or period of validity. This is another common nonconformance, by the way. It doesn't say that your measurement equipment has to be labeled necessarily. But it is a common practice to have everything labeled with a calibration sticker where it says what the date it was calibrated and when the due date is. But you'll notice it says all equipment requiring calibration or which has a defined period of validity shall be labeled, coded, or otherwise identified to allow the user of the equipment to readily identify the status of calibration or period of validity. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this because I've given nonconformities in this area. Specifically, I'll give you a scenario that happens more than once. I see your balance isn't calibrated. I get the response, well, we have records of the calibration of that, and we're okay with that because it doesn't have to be labeled, but it just has to be identified somewhere. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. However, it shall be labeled, coded, or otherwise identified to allow the user of the equipment to readily identify the status of calibration or period of validity. So my question is, okay, you have this documented somewhere. Mr. Analyst, the one I'm witnessing running the test, how do you know this is calibrated? Where's the documentation that says it's calibrated? And he spends the next half hour looking for it. Okay, that tells me that it is not readily available to identify the status of calibration. In other words, the lab analyst doesn't know really if it's been calibrated or not. He knows there's some kind of paper out there that says it might be, but he really doesn't know where it is. So if it's not right there, or the analyst isn't trained to look at that document before using it to know whether it's been calibrated or it's okay to use, then you haven't met the requirement of section 6.4.8. The easiest way is to label the measurement equipment so that they can just look at it real quick. They're in a hurry, they're busy, they're running other tests. Make it easy for them to identify the calibration status of the equipment. So I just wanted to kind of stand on my pedestal on that. There are, all the accreditation bodies once a year list the largest number of, or what clause elements have the largest number of nonconformities. This happens to be one of them. Section 6.4.8. It's in the top 10 list. Let's keep that in mind. Then section 6.4.9, equipment that has been subjected to overloading or mishandling gives questionable results or has been shown to be defective or outside specified requirements shall be taken out of service. It shall be isolated to prevent its use, clearly labeled, marked being out of service. And the other key here is the laboratory shall examine the effect of the defect or deviation from specified requirements and shall initiate the management of nonconforming work procedure. See section 710. 710 is nonconforming work. So if you have a piece of equipment that failed and you're taking it out of operation, you have to generate a nonconformance. You have to generate an internal nonconforming work. If an auditor sees that a piece of equipment is out of service and labeled, that's great, should be labeled. But if you don't have a nonconformance written for it, you're going to get a nonconformance. Just keep that in mind. And then 6410, when intermediate checks are necessary to maintain the confidence in the performance of the equipment, these checks shall be carried out in accordance with the procedure. This could be in your equipment maintenance procedure. This refers to things like you might get your balance calibrated once a year by a calibration company, but then you periodically check it with reference standards to do intermediate checks of the balance. Same is true with doing certified reference standards for chemical testing for things like elemental analysis or heavy metals or something like that. That's what your reference standards are for. So that's section 6410. Then we get into 6411. When calibration and reference material data include reference values or correction factors, the laboratory shall ensure the reference values or correction factors are updated and implemented. One application of this is if you have a lot of thermometers, you have a lot of incubators, you have one master, say, reference thermometer that you're comparing the other incubator thermometers to, or the digital readout of the incubator. You might be comparing that to a internal reference standard or a reference thermometer, and you develop a correction factor because you'll notice maybe the digital readout of the incubator is maybe a half a degree different than the reference thermometer. You want to keep track of those correction factors on some sort of monitoring log of some sort. That's what 6411 is about. And then 6412, the laboratory shall take practicable measures to prevent unintended adjustments of the equipment from invalidating results. So, don't have your balance on the edge of a corner of the lab where somebody can walk by and knock it on the floor. Make practicable measures to keep instruments safe from being unadjusted. Then we get into, finally, the last section of 6.4, which is a beefy one, section 6.4.13. This is all about records. Now, best practices typically have been, you'll see records shall be maintained for equipment which can influence laboratory activities. The record shall include the following where applicable, and it has A through H. Typically what labs do, which is common practice, is they'll have a spreadsheet, a master equipment list, and all the columns will be basically, they cover A through H within the column structure of the equipment list, say in Excel, right? There'll be columns. They might combine like A and B or whatever, but the idea is that you maintain records and you include each one of these. Now, this is another common nonconformance, and I'll tell you a hint here. One of the most common nonconformances fall into A, identity of equipment. Everybody usually has that, but a lot of labs don't have, including software and firmware version history. This course doesn't apply to I just messed that up. There we go. It doesn't apply to every piece of equipment because not all equipment has firmware or software versions. But for the ones that are applicable, you might have a separate, my recommendation is to have a separate column for firmware software version history, and then where applicable, put the current software version. Where not applicable, just put NA. But that is a very common finding. Assessors look for this because it's low-hanging fruit and it's an easy nonconformance to identify. So just make sure your equipment list has A through H. You don't have to have all of these items on one list. It could be you can have all of these items on 2 or 3 different forms or what have you. But best practices is usually a master equipment list with A through H as the columns in a spreadsheet. Then we go right into section 6.5, which in my opinion is the most important section of the whole standard. If you understand section 6.5, you understand calibration. Many really, really, really smart analysts don't understand calibration. I will That's been my experience. Calibration is really measurement traceability by definition. You are tracing something to the SI units through NIST through a reference standard. That's it. That's calibration in a nutshell. Section 6.5.1, the laboratory shall establish and maintain metrological traceability of its measurement results by means of a documented, unbroken chain of calibrations, each contributing to the measurement uncertainty, linking them to an appropriate reference. Now, I audit a lot of testing labs. A lot of testing labs will tell me that measurement uncertainty doesn't apply to them when it comes to calibration. I'm here to tell you, yes, it does. And this is where, right? You need to have calibration records, whether they are provided to you from a calibration provider or you're doing reference standards internally. You need to link them to the unbroken chain of calibrations, each contributing to the measurement uncertainty, linking them to an appropriate reference. That means your calibration certificate you're getting from your vendor needs to show an expanded measurement of uncertainty, linking to a appropriate reference standard. That is why that the standard typically requires that you use an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory to perform your calibrations in accordance with ISO 17025. It's one thing to be accredited to ISO 17025, the calibration laboratory. It's another thing to not perform the calibrations in accordance with ISO 17025. Those are two different things. And let me explain why. You can have Mettler, which is a 17025 accredited company, perform a calibration service for your balance not in accordance with ISO 17025 because you didn't ask them to do it in accordance with ISO 17025. This is very important because if it's not on the calibration certificate that it was performed in accordance with ISO 17025 and it doesn't have an expanded measurement uncertainty on the calibration certificate, you will get a finding in section 6.5.1. You'll also note in note 1, ISO IEC Guide 99, metrological traceability is defined as the property of a measurement result whereby the result can be related to a reference through a documented unbroken chain of calibrations, each contributing to measurement uncertainty. This is emphasized several places, and then it also says note C Annex A. I'm going to go real quick to the standard and go all the way down to Annex A, because if you can understand this, you're a step ahead of the rest. So Annex A talks about establishing metrological traceability, and I encourage you to read this in the standard. This is on Annex A of the 17025 standard. Talks about measurement traceability, what the requirements are. Talks about what you need to meet the requirements of the standard. Talks about using ISO 17034 accredited traceability. Here, I'll show you where that is. Yeah, right in here. Certified values of certified reference materials from reference material producers conforming to ISO 17034 provide metrological traceability. If for some reason you can't find one that is, you need to have some sort of system that has a mutual recognition agreement with measures of a mutual recognition agreement International Committee for Weights and Measures, some sort of entity that has this MRA symbol and is an accredited company that provides these metrological traceable standards, mainly CRMs. So if you're not purchasing CRMs, and if it doesn't have the 17034 logo, you will most likely get a nonconformance from your auditor. So I just wanted to point that out. So let's go back to 6.5.1. Then we go on to 6.5.2. Laboratories shall ensure that measurement results are traceable to the international system of units through A or B or C. These are or statements. They are not and statements. And they are not and or statements. They are or statements. You shall meet the traceability requirements through A, calibration provided by a competent laboratory. In other words, you hire a laboratory to do your calibrations for you. And it says, note 1, laboratories fulfilling the requirements of this document are considered to be competent. This document, meaning ISO 17025. That means the calibration provider needs to be ISO 17025 accredited, and they need to provide an ISO 17025 accredited calibration certificate that says they are accredited ISO. The certificate has to say that. It has to have their logo, their company's logo, and you need to know who their accreditation body is and what their cert number is. That has to be on the calibration certificate. There's no ands, ifs, or buts about this. If you don't have this on calibration certificates, then you need to get one that does, and you can battle that with your calibration company, but this is what you need to have. They are ISO 17025 accredited. There are reporting requirements under section 7.8, which I will get to on a future video, but there are requirements that ISO 17025 calibration companies need to put on their calibration reports, and they need to have the expanded uncertainty of measurement I mentioned, and they need to be in accordance with ISO 17025. If they did not perform the calibration in accordance with ISO 17025, they probably won't have an expanded uncertainty of measurement on the certificate. That is a sure sign that they did not perform the calibration activity in accordance with ISO 17025. They either didn't have the equipment to provide that expanded uncertainty of measurement, or they just didn't do it. So keep that in mind when you're farming out calibrations to a laboratory. You need to make sure they're going to perform it in accordance with ISO 17025. Now that I beat that to death, the next way of meeting the metrological traceability requirements is to use certified values of certified reference materials provided by a competent producer with stated metrological traceability to the SI. Note 2, reference material producers fulfilling the requirements of ISO 17034 are considered to be competent. That means your reference standards need to be ISO 17034 produced, and they need to say that on the certificate of analysis. And yes, this does apply to microbiological testing. And yes, there are organism controls that you can buy that are from ISO 17034 produced companies, such as microbiologics. They are an example of one. So I don't know how many microbiological labs I've heard say we can't get organisms that are 17034 produced. Yes, you can. I can name quite a few companies that do. So that's not an excuse. So for you microbiological testing labs out there, make sure you're, number one, you are using a positive control. If you're not, you're going to get a finding in section 7.7. And if you are using controls, which you should be, then they need to be ISO 17034 purchased and produced. And then there's direct realization of the SI units ensured by comparison, indirectly or directly with national or international standards. This would be in the case of, I mentioned the thermometer. You can have a non-calibrated thermometer compared to one that is traceable with a calibration certificate and do an indirect comparison. And as long as you're documenting that, that's perfectly okay. So to meet the requirements essentially of calibration, you can do it with A or B or C. Many companies combine A and B, but you don't have to. And then we go on to the last section of, I think it's the last one. Yeah, last section of 6.5 is 6.5.3. When metrological traceability to the SI units is not technically possible, the laboratory shall demonstrate metrological traceability to an appropriate reference. And that would be to a certified value of certified reference materials provided by a competent producer. In other words, this would be an indirect comparison, kind of like C, but goes a little further. And I'll give you an example. It could be moisture analysis. If you're having a difficult time finding a 17034 produced moisture reference standard, like sodium chloride or something like that, but you're using a moisture balance, you could use reference weights, since it is a balance, to do an appropriate metrological traceability to those reference weights, because that is also traceable to the SI units through NIST. So that would be an example of 6.5.3 when it's not metrologically traceable, when it's not possible, you could do an indirect comparison to something that is. So that would be 6.5.3. Then we get into the last section of Clause 6, finally, Clause 6.6, externally provided products and services. Here is another one where there's a procedure that is required. So 6.6.1, the laboratory shall ensure that only suitable externally provided products and services that affect laboratory activities are used. That basically, from a documentation standpoint, means some sort of approved vendor list. You want to make sure that anything that's intended for incorporation into the laboratory's own activities, that we ensure that only suitable externally provided products and services are used. So that's what 6.6.1 is about. Then we go into 6.6.2. Again, the laboratory shall have a procedure and retain records for. So, the laboratory have a purchasing procedure? Yes. The laboratory shall have a procedure and retain records for defining, reviewing, and approving the laboratory's requirements for externally provided products and services, defining criteria for evaluation. So you need to evaluate your vendors. You need criteria for evaluation, selection, monitoring, and of the performance and reevaluation of external providers. So you need to be able to have a system where you are rating your providers. And then ensuring that externally provided products and services conform to the laboratory's established requirements. This is an example of the Mettler situation I told you about earlier. Yes, Mettler is accredited ISO 17025, but you need to ensure that the services they provide you meet the requirements of this document, meaning 17025, and your own internal requirements. You need to state that on a purchase order or something, and that's what the auditor will look for, is proof that you're communicating the requirements to your vendor. And then take actions arising from these evaluations that you perform and that sort of thing. So we continue with section 6.6.3. The laboratory shall communicate its requirements to external providers. I just mentioned that. You need to make sure you communicate these requirements of the products and services to be provided, the acceptance criteria, the competence and activities that the laboratory or its customer intends to perform at external premises. If you don't do external testing outside of your facility, then this could be non-applicable. So that's really it for Clause 6. I want to talk a little bit about now the documentation requirements. So Section 6.6, Section 6.2 requires a training procedure. You need job descriptions and a training matrix. 6.3 requires environmental monitoring records. So you need records with relevant specifications. 6.4, you need required equipment maintenance procedure. Again, a required procedure. You need an equipment list with those A through H requirements I showed you, and then calibration labels on your instruments. 6.5, you need to have calibration certificates from an ISO 17025 provider, and you need to have reference material C of A's from an ISO 17034 competent producer for section or clause 6.5. Finally, clause 6.6, required externally provided products and services procedure, approved vendor list, vendor evaluation form of some sort, and a purchase order type of document to show that you've communicated your requirements to your provider. Now, what I'm going to do is show you a couple examples of what these procedures would look like. So here's an example of a training procedure that would be, used for any lab. I actually wrote a required set of procedures that you can purchase from me. I'll include the link in the bottom of this video, but it's for $49. You can get a complete set of all the required procedures. And this is an example of one. It is a personnel competence and training procedure. You know, we have everything that meets the requirements of Section 6.2 is here in this procedure. It has determining competence requirements, selection of personnel, supervision of personnel, all those things that you saw in the standard. And then within the appendices, I do have a competence assessment form and then a training record form that you could use, and then a personnel authorization record and an example of a job description that would have all of the requirements that you would need, including competence requirements. So you would have that available to you in the procedure. This is what a training procedure would look like. And then we have an example of, um, even though it's not required, there is an environmental control, laboratory environmental control procedure that we offer in the package. But the thing that is, like here's documented environmental requirements that are required. They don't have to be in a procedure, but you need to have them documented somewhere. But in this procedure, there are an environmental monitoring log that you could use that is required. So this procedure would meet all the requirements for section 6.3. And then we have a procedure for maintenance and calibration. Maintenance calibration equipment procedure, which is a required procedure. It has all of the requirements of section 6.4 contained within it. And then again, you can go to appendices, which will have an equipment inventory log, equipment calibration log, and then a maintenance log. And between these three logs, you meet all the requirements that are in the requirements for records that I showed you in 6.4.13. So those are all the required procedures that you have. And then basically some of the resources that I have available for if your laboratory is looking to get ready for an accreditation audit, whether that is your first ISO 17025 audit or you're preparing for a reaccreditation or surveillance audit. I offer a 45-minute free consultation, and I provide that link in the description of this video. I have developed a quality manual and procedures template, which I showed you. A full-blown quality manual with all the requirements pointing to required procedures, and then you have the option to upgrade and get all of the required procedures. There are 23 procedures and a 56-page quality manual that will give you all of the documentation requirements of the standard to help you prepare for your ISO 17025 audit. It's reasonably priced, $49 for the quality manual and additional $49 for all of the required policies, procedures, and forms. And then I also offer a free internal audit gap analysis checklist that I offer on my website, and I'll also provide the link for that here. And then also, what's next? We do have Clause 7 video coming up after this one. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel for updates when I release Section 7, and then download the free internal audit checklist. And also, if you've missed Clause 4, 5 of this video series and you would like to go back and watch those, I do have a blog post that I'll leave in the description as well. Let me show you what that blog post looks like here. Really should be able to get that for you here. Maybe. Yeah. You know what I'll do is I'll go, yeah, here's the blog post. So in the description box, I have a full article on ISO 17025 clauses explained, a complete guide for laboratory accreditation. And you can see from this page, you can also get my free internal audit checklist. But every single clause element is covered in this. I go impartiality. Here's the video for clause 4. And then I have the video for clause 5. And then when I'm done with this video, I'll put clause 6, and then you'll be able to get clause 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, which will meet all of the clause elements of the ISO IEC 17025 standard, and that will get you covered. So stay tuned for the next video in the series, which will be clause 7. This is Ralph Martin signing off. You make it a great day.